And then, all right, excellent. Miriam and Margot, I think I'll just give you all the floor and take it away.
Thanks so much,
All
Sean.
right.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our session. We've got issues conducting a periodicals inventory from A to Z. I'm Miriam Nauenburg. I'm the Serials and Electronic Resources Cataloger at the University of West Georgia.
I'm Margot Davis. I'm the Resource Sharing Specialist, also at the University of West Georgia.
And today, Margot and I will be sharing how we performed an inventory of nearly 3,000 titles in our periodicals collection, which we have on the ground floor of our library. And we hope this will be helpful for folks who might be facing a similar issue or a project that's coming up. We want to share with you what we did and the lessons that we learned from it. So let's jump into it. Here's what we're going to be covering today. First, we'll talk about the project, why we decided to do it, the scope of the project. We'll talk about how we prepared for it, the reporting needs that we had, how Margot fixed up the spreadsheet for her own needs and her training of the students. We'll look at the types of problems we encountered when we actually got into the inventory, as well as some spreadsheet revisions that we needed to do. We'll talk about some cataloging follow-up that I handled, depending on the problems that we discovered on the shelves. We'll talk about what we would have done differently with the lessons we have from everything we did, and some next steps that we're looking at with our periodicals collection. Okay, so here's the project. I'm going to turn it back over to Margot to discuss the project and where it started.
So in spring of 2022, I joined the Print Periodicals Working Group, and the committee was about to begin a weeding project of the print periodicals for 3 reasons. First, the periodical weeding was long overdue. During the pandemic in 2020, we canceled pretty much everything, so we were no longer receiving physical issues, and we wanted to check and make sure we had a better use of possible space. So doing the inventory would be the first step. The project scope. It was originally to be a multi-year project divided into phases. Phase 1 was going to be analytics training and report creation between me and Miriam for fall 2022. Phase 2 would be the inventory of the print physical periodical collection itself with a completion date set for spring of 2023. The inventory was actually begun in November of 2022 and completed earlier than expected in 2023. Phase 3 was to be a comparison of the physical and electronic holdings with a bonus phase that we were hopeful to do an inventory of electronic holdings to clean up records with a projected date of completion for January 2024. And then the project would be completed, handing it over to the liaisons for review in fall 2024. So the setup, and I'm going to hand it back over to Miriam to let her explain the slides.
Thanks, Margot. So when we first started thinking about this project, we had to start with a shelf report, basically from analytics. And this was the original conception of that report. So we started in the physical item subject area, and these were the fields that I added to the report. I added OCLC number. I added title complete. This is not the title field, but title complete. And the reason is title complete uses the 245 subfields A, B, C, P, and N, and then there are some others. We used title complete because of subfields P and N, which are the name, the number of the part or section of a work, and the name of a part or section of a work, respectively. So we needed that info, especially for a lot of our science titles. And if we just had the 245 subfield A, it might not give us enough information. So that's why we use title complete. I used the author field, which of course references the 1XX marked fields in the record. Author contributor, which references the 7XX fields, so the added entries. Uniform title, which for serials is almost always a 130, but that would also bring in the 240 field if that was the case. And then also ISSN, which indexes to the 022 subfields L and A. From the holdings details folder in analytics, we used the summary holdings field, which goes back to the 866 subfield A. And if you have multiple subfields, if you have multiple 866 fields like we do, we have additional fields to note gaps. All of the fields will be included in one cell and they'll be separated with semicolons. So it will include all that you have there. We also included our local param fields that we have chosen to map to the 867 and 868 fields for supplements and indexes, respectively. As far as the filters for the report, we asked that the bibs be suppressed. That they not be suppressed, because we have several records that are suppressed and we just didn't want Margot and her team looking for those down there. They don't refer to anything. Life cycle of active, And we limited to our locations that are in our ground floor periodicals section. And there were 3: periodicals, periodicals microfilm, and reference indexes. So this is what we started with. And I'm going to turn it back over to Margot for the creation of the spreadsheet and the modeling and molding of it.
So as Miriam showed us, we had a lot of raw data, but no organization. So the spreadsheet needed to evolve. This initial spreadsheet was raw data filtered on OCLC number, and the titles were not in strict alphabetical order. This was not the earliest version, as we'd already moved the public notes and summary holdings field to be more prominent, which is something you'll hear me talk about a lot. So the public notes field was essential because it showed the shelved as titles, and the location name made it easier to distinguish paper from microfilm holdings when you're down in the stacks themselves. In the final version, we added a function to put the list in strict alphabetical order, removing initial articles of a, an, and the from the title field. The columns were also moved around more to make the summary holdings and public notes fields more prominent, as well as the uniform title field. So here's the final version where you can see the alphabetical order and how we made the certain fields more prominent. And of course, we needed 2 other things. First, we needed a checkbox to mark that something had been completed. And then we added a field all the way at the start for needs Miriam attention, the catch-all where people could mark down whatever the issues that we found were so that Miriam could fix it. And if you note, it says bold equals done. So we had a way of tracking what Miriam was working on. As for the inventory itself, the spreadsheet had 3 separate pages: the main title list, a discard sheet, and the problem page. The discards was added due to an early public note about JSTOR discards, and when we found them still on the shelf. Problems was added the first time we encountered a title not on the shelf. The problem sheet ended up being our biggest problem. As you can see, it was kind of just made up as it went along. There's not quite as much organization. And one of the biggest fields was the found on spreadsheet, because the shelved as titles became a problem, which I'll talk about more in a minute. So we were lucky enough to have 3 students who helped us. They were borrowed from circulation as inventory overlapped with winter break. Most of the project had them either working in pairs or with me. And it worked out that one student preferred looking at physical issues and another preferred updating the spreadsheet. The students were given very basic training. They were to check beginning and end dates, mark things complete, make the basic changes, and they were told to add anything complicated to the problem sheet for staff to fix, which is another reason why the problem spreadsheet became kind of a problem. The students were given a list of common issues that they were expected to find, different ending or beginning dates, titles that were listed as current but we no longer subscribe to, strange or inconsistent numbering or titles, and they were warned that microfilm was absolutely going to be a problem. So the problems we encountered: first, technology, the biggest one, which I refer to as adventures with an old iPad. I mentioned that shelved as titles were a problem, and that was because scrolling on the iPad did not work particularly well. So if I saw there was a shelved as note, it did not always make it easy to go find it. So instead, they were put on this problem spreadsheet to be found later. The other issue was lack of Wi-Fi in some areas and why we needed student help. In some cases, we were unable to get a signal in the stacks itself, and we needed somebody to stand outside the stacks while someone yelled what the actual beginning and ending holdings was. Another problem was titles. Shelved as titles is mentioned, but there were also titles that were still on the shelf despite supposedly being discarded, and titles that when we had moved them down to the ground floor in a renovation over a decade ago were shelved completely out of order, making confirming first and last issues very difficult. One of the biggest issues were titles that had multiple holding records and matching which holdings and titles went with which record. In this example of American Teacher, we had to check several different boxes of microfilm and check off all of them on the spreadsheet. Another example was just having the title complete holdings would not help was the economic review. Here, the uniform title let us figure out which title goes with which record, especially as the dates would not help. And of course, there was an infrastructure problem, or that time we found a shelf that was completely about to collapse. And now Miriam's going to tell us about how we handled fixing all of the problems we found.
Thanks, Margot. So as Margot and her team were moving through the stacks, finding problems, I was going along behind them in the catalog to try to update and fix those particular problems. So before I get into examples of the problems we found, I just want to touch base really quickly on serials holding levels, and then also tell you the fields in the bibliographic record that I used to try to resolve some of these problems. So holding levels for serials and multi-part monographs are defined in the holding statements for bibliographic items, ANSI NISO Z3971. Originally put out in 2006, but a revision came out in 2011. So level 3 holdings are what we use for our microfilm, and level 4 holdings are what we use for our print periodicals. Level 3 are summary level holdings where gaps are not necessarily noted. Not all levels of enumeration and chronology are represented. So an example of this would be a very simple statement, volume 1 to volume 2, 1985 to 1986. That's level 3. Level 4 holdings are detailed level holdings. Gaps are noted, whether they're gaps or any kind of break is noted, a gap or a non-gap break. All levels of enumeration and chronology are represented. An example of this would be volume 1, number 4 to volume 3, number 1, October 2000 to January 2023. So that's a level 4 holding. You'll hear me refer to these a little bit throughout the presentation. I just wanted to touch base on that. As far as the bibliographic fields that are useful in this kind of project, these are the fields I used the most in the bibliographic record to resolve questions. The best field is the 362 field, and not all serial bib records have a 362 field. But if they do, well, they do have a field. It doesn't always have a particular issue in it. It might just say began in 1977 or whatever it might be. So this field is useful to determine the first or the last issue, sometimes both if you're lucky. Will be listed in this field. So that was extremely helpful in determining when an issue or a particular title ended and when another title would then begin. The 780 and 785 fields are linking entries, and they're used to link back to a preceding entry or to link ahead to a succeeding entry. So if a journal has a title that comes after it, there's been a title change, it will have a 785 field with that information. There will also be a subfield W in the 785 field with the OCLC number of that record. And then lastly, the 515 note was also useful for any kind of numbering peculiarities, and we found a few of those. So it was helpful to have that 515 note in those cases. Some other fields that were useful are the 008 field, positions 7 through 14. These are the date 1 and date 2 fixed fields. So this is a really easy way to see the lifespan of a journal. The 500 note is a general note, so it gives information on any alternative numbering schemes. That question came up a couple times. And then the 525 note is a supplement note. If a particular journal has a supplement that we're wondering, does it get its own bib record, or should we be looking for an additional bib record to catalog it? Oftentimes the 525 note can help with those kinds of questions. Also, just something I found when I was doing this, because we have a lot of different formats. We have paper and microfilm. And they would often sometimes switch between the two formats within a single title. So if you're doing a project like this, just be mindful of the format changes if you're hopping from record to record using those 780 or 785 fields, because those linking fields are only going to link to the succeeding or preceding title of the same format. So if you have a particular title that the succeeding title is microfilm and your current title is paper, if you link to that 785, that succeeding title, it's going to be the paper record, not the microfilm record. So we often had to research the title in order to account for those format changes. So I'm going to jump into the problems we found now, and I'm going to show you some examples of what we found and how we fixed it. So the first collection of problems are what we call the simple microfilm box label problems. And these really weren't too involved. They often involved title, open holdings that were supposed to be closed, and just incorrect dates for titles that were filmed together. They were pretty easy to fix. They didn't require too much investigation. So an example of incorrect title is, you can see here, Bulletin, American Association of School Physicians, had been incorrectly labeled in the before photo, you can see, as American Associations of School Physicians Bulletin. Not a big deal, just an additional word there, but technically not the correct title from the 245. So we fixed that. Sometimes we found incorrect open holdings. So these are two examples of that particular phenomenon. We have the Journals of Gerontology, Series B, and Rural Sociology. You can see in the microfilm boxes, they were still open holdings. So it's just a simple matter to retype the label and insert it into the box holder. Sometimes we have incorrect beginner end dates for titles filmed together. This one was a little tricky. This is Dunn's Review. And this had many title changes throughout its span on our shelf. The previous label on the previous box said that the Dunn's Review ended with volume 92 in 1968, and the succeeding title of Dunn's began with volume 93 in 1970, and that was not correct. After review, I was able to determine that, in fact, there were some differences. Dunn's Review actually ended with volume 94 in 1969, not volume 92 in 1968. And that also meant that the beginning issue of the succeeding title was moved back. So Dunn's begins with volume 95 in 1970, not volume 93 in 1970. So fixing one issue, one particular title, we also have to be sure that the succeeding title is also taken care of as well. Items from other locations were found in the periodicals area. This particular example was a government document. It had somehow migrated downstairs, and it was shelved under the physics and chemistry title. You can see it here next to the block, Physics and Chemistry of Solids. And this is actually a government document serial called Journal of Research of the National Bureau of Standards, Section A, Physics and Chemistry. So in this case, we removed this volume from the shelf. I scanned it in to make sure it didn't have any kind of missing status or there was something else going on with it. And we just reshelved it in the GovDocs area. Sometimes titles appear to be the same title, but they're not. So an example here is supervisory management. You can see in the before picture here, there's a single label with supervisory management, volume 28 to volume 31, and volume 34 to volume 41, number 3. So that's what we had before. The problem with this is that a person could assume that both sets of those holdings were for the same title, and then there's just a little gap in between with some issues of that title that we don't own. And that's not really what's going on here. These are actually two titles. One is supervisory management. That was correct. The second set of holdings referred to supervisory management, Saranac Lake, New York. That's the uniform title. So it actually is the same title, but it isn't. So I added some labels to clarify this. The gap, quote unquote, on the first label was actually an intervening title that we didn't own. So this is a way that we clarified what appeared to be a gap was actually not a gap of a single title. It was two individual discrete titles in the box. Sometimes we had titles that were not cataloged and should not be cataloged. So in this case, we have weather log. You can see here on the previous screen here that I took a picture of weather log sitting in its own magazine holder. And I thought at first it was its own title, and we had the option to catalog it that way. But according to the LC record, weather log is a section of weather, which we also had on the shelf. So there's a 500 note in the LC record and a 740 field for uncontrolled related title entry for weather log. So it's kind of like a supplement. So in this case, I added it as a supplement holding here in the 866. I didn't add it as an 867 because I wasn't quite sure because it was considered a section of it. So if it were truly a supplement, then 867 would have probably been the appropriate thing to do here. But we chose to add it as an 866. And I used quotation marks around weather log to enclose the name of the unit. And then I just added the holdings after it according to the ANSI and ISO standard. So that's how we chose to handle this. Another library might have chosen to handle it a little bit differently, but this is what worked for us. Sometimes titles were just overlooked because they were with other titles on the shelf that were cataloged and they just kind of faded into the background a little bit. So one example is EITV. You can see here in the picture here, we have several bound pieces of educational and industrial television. And then we have a bunch of loose issues at the end, which are the EITV issues. And the EITV issues were not cataloged. So they were shelved with their previous title, but we had no way in the catalog for people to find them. So in this case, I cataloged them. I added a shelved as note. They're shelved as educational and industrial television. And you can see the issues already had their own little label, shelve as educational and industrial television. So that was already completed. Sometimes titles are just very similar. And in this case, we found a really interesting example, database and database. So database with the space between the two words was on the shelf, but it wasn't cataloged. And then database, all one word, was cataloged. So this was a situation, Margot caught this. These are not the same title, and I needed to catalog one of them. And of course, we have some titles on the shelf that weren't cataloged. One example of this is Welfare in Review. This was not some title that was hidden in a microfilm reel with something else. That's at least explainable. This was clearly labeled under its own name. It was shelved under its own name. We owned 9 years worth of microfilm, but it wasn't cataloged. So in this case, I just cataloged it and added it to the periodicals microfilm location. Sometimes issues of a particular title were shelved with preceding or succeeding titles. So an example of this is NASSP Newsleader. You can see on the left here. This is the last issue of that title, volume 46, number 9. This issue was shelved with the succeeding title, Newsleader. And here I have a picture of the first issue of that title, volume 47, number 1. So the image on the left, this issue was shelved with the issue on the right. And you could see it looking at them, it looks just like it's Newsleader. So in that case, we made a note on the issue, shelve as NASSP Newsleader. And that in turn affected our holdings for NASSP Newsleader because those holdings didn't have that volume 46, number 9. So we were able to move that issue back to where it belonged and update those holdings. Sometimes there was some confusion with cover versus title page. So in this case, we have a bunch of issues of ATQ, which are the blue bound volumes that you see on the right side of the photo here. And then it is shelved with some loose issues of the preceding title, which is not ATQ, which is what you might expect from looking at the cover there, but American Transcendental Quarterly. So here we chose, because of the huge ATQ on the cover, just shelve it with the bound issues of ATQ. But in this case, according to the title page, which was the chief source in this instance, this title is actually American Transcendental Quarterly. But again, it was easier to keep it with that succeeding title. And we added a shelved as note in the record for American Transcendental Quarterly, so folks would know to look under ATQ. Sometimes a title changes for only a few issues, and we had to decide, well, how do we want to handle this? Do we want to shelve those issues under their own title or keep them where they are with their preceding or succeeding title and have a shelved as note? So an example of this is e-content. E-content was shelved with its preceding title, database, and there were only a few issues of e-content. I think there were like 6 or 7 issues. And that's too few really to shelve on their own. You know, they can be in a magazine holder, but then they flop over. It just didn't seem like it was really a good use of our space or our time to try to move them. So we kept them where they were, shelved with database. And I added a shelved as note in the 852 subfield Z of the record for e-content, saying that these issues were shelved as database. And then also, because this is basically a two-way street here, with any time you have a shelved as note, there's the shelved as note in the catalog, which is telling patrons where to find the resource. We also needed to add shelve as notes to the issues themselves, so our shelvers would know where to put them, so that the cataloging note made sense. So we added those labels to those issues as well. Shelve as database. Sometimes titles were sandwiched in strange ways on microfilm reels, and we had to figure all that out. So here are some examples of that particular issue. One is Criminologica. So this was discovered by chance during the reconciliation phase. This title was cataloged, but the box wasn't labeled. So fortunately, Margot, as she was working through, decided to open up the box and she saw that there was this reel inside the box that was labeled with this additional title. So that's how we eventually came to realize, okay, there's a problem here. We need to make sure this box is labeled correctly. So in this case, I double checked the holdings for both titles. I added that shelving note in the catalog for Criminologica, that it's shelved as criminology. And then also 2 new box labels. So the first label was to clarify that Criminology's holdings began with volume 8, not with volume 1. And Criminologica was also included in the box, and it had holdings of volume 1 to volume 7. Another interesting example was Community and Junior College Journal. This was shelved as Junior College Journal, although the majority of reels in the box were actually for Community and Junior College Journal. So that was the first kind of interesting thing. The second interesting thing was that even though most of those reels were Community and Junior College Journal, the box itself labeled as Junior College Journal, that one reel for Junior College Journal was itself not cataloged. So we had some work to do with this one. So the way that we resolved it, I cataloged Junior College Journal with a shelved as note to point to Community and Junior College Journal, which is the label that the box eventually got, and that's where it was shelved in the C's. And then the box was moved back to where it belonged. This way, anybody looking at this box knows we've got Community and Junior College Journal in the majority of the box, but we also have a few issues of Junior College Journal. Third and final example here, Journal of Physical and Colloid Chemistry was sandwiched between Journal of Physical Chemistry and Journal of Physical Chemistry Part 2, you could say. The second title, the uniform title, would have begun in, I think 1956, I think is when it started, or 1952, excuse me. So that's the last one. So here, these reels were labeled as Journal of Physical Chemistry. And we wanted folks to know if they were using these reels that it actually is supposed to be Journal of Physical and Colloid Chemistry for those few years that the title changed. And we added a shelve as note as well on the reel. So again, we'd know where to shelve them when patrons were finished using them. Sometimes binding titles can be a little confusing or sometimes even inaccurate. In this case, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York had 2 publications. One is called Quarterly Review, and one is called Monthly Review. And we have loose issues of those. If I back up just a moment to my preceding slide, you can see here these loose issues in the photo. Those were the Quarterly Review and the Monthly Review. However, the title, as you can see, I've reproduced the authorized or the access points here at the bottom. Quarterly Review was actually the title for that particular issue, and Monthly Review for those sets of issues. So in this case, we made sure that we had shelved as notes in both of these catalog records for Quarterly Review and Monthly Review, shelved as Federal Reserve Bank of New York. We found some confusing block labels that kind of cross-reference and tell patrons where to look for something if it's shelved in a different area. So this particular block for School Physicians Bulletin had some issues. There was some non-standard holdings description, some letters were missing. So I cleaned it up a little bit, typed it out again, and then pasted it back over the old label and just put some tape over it. Again, nothing extremely beautiful or fancy, but functional and allows the patrons to find the information that they're looking for if they're browsing in the stacks. Sometimes titles were misshelved due to a similar appearance. So this was a very interesting example of Performance and Instruction, the last 6 issues of which were shelved with the succeeding title, Performance Improvement. And I've laid all these issues out here and took this picture to show you how similar they looked. They have the same white background, they have the same kind of typography, font style, coloring. The only difference is, if you're not looking really carefully, you might think all these are for one particular issue, especially since the 2 journals are shelved next to each other on the shelf. So in this case, it was just a simple matter. Double check the holdings, make sure our catalog was correct. And then once we determined that, I simply moved these issues of Performance and Instruction back to where they belonged. Some titles had numbering irregularities that made us kind of question, was there a title change? Because you normally don't see this many numbering changes with a single title. An example of this is sales and marketing management. So we had 2 numbering changes with this title. The first numbering change, we went from volume 162, number 1 to volume 10, number 1. And this happened because it was absorbed by Salesforce XP and it had adopted its numbering. So that's information I got from the catalog record. There was another numbering change, though, very soon after that, volume 10, number 6 to volume 94, number 1, which happened later that same year. So this was unusual. I haven't seen too many serials that have that many numbering changes in such a short period of time, but this was indeed all the same title. But Margot and her team flagged this because it did look very unusual. So this is the sort of thing that we were investigating during the follow-up phase. Sometimes there were some shelf listing quandaries and decisions that we had to make. So in this case, I'll give you 2 examples. This first example is New Perspectives on the 18th Century. Now, the actual title is 18, New Perspectives on the 18th Century, and 18 is in Roman numerals. Now, according to the Library of Congress Classification and Shelf Listing Manual, file numbers expressed in digits or other notation, such as Roman numerals, before letters of the alphabet. So in this case, this journal should have been shelved before A, but it was shelved under N for New Perspectives on the 18th Century. We left it where it was. The issues all had notes on them, shelve as. It was not worth it to change it. We had very few issues, but we decided to leave them where they were. And I made sure that we had a shelved as note in the catalog. And the important thing is that patrons can find it and that our staff can shelve it correctly if they're being used. So this is just one example of shelf listing differences in how the rules can be applied. Another example, RBER, Review of Business and Economic Research. This was shelved as Review of Business and Economic Research, but the Library of Congress Classification and Shelf Listing Manual says, treat acronyms and initials not separated in any way as single words regardless of capitalization. So in this case, this particular journal should have been shelved under RBER, not RE for Review of Business and Economic Research. But again, just like with the previous example, we left it where it wasn't hurting anything. We have a note in the catalog, I made sure of that, and we decided it was just the best thing to do in this particular instance. Sometimes there were huge runs of title changes shelved together, and it made for some confusing times in trying to verify the holdings for those constituent titles. So this is Parents Magazine on the shelf. We hold, in this case, 1929 to 2011, but it's different iterations of Parents Magazine. So on this slide, I've reproduced the different title changes that are all shelved in that particular area. Now, Children, the first issue, the first title, actually is shelved under its own name, but there are some issues in the 1929 year that are shelved as, or filmed with Parents Magazine and shelved under that title as well. So you can see here, this would be a very difficult situation to try to go through. Let me back up a slide and note on all of these microfilm box labels, all the different titles that are there. So it's good to have things be correct at the shelf, but you also have to figure, what would be the best thing for our users? Is it going to be an issue of cluttering up a label? So sometimes we couldn't always do as much as we would have liked. So in this case, we did not pursue adding these labels to the boxes. Although these titles are noted in the catalog, shelved as Parents, and we figured that was sufficient. Here's an example of where we added shelving notes to the catalog and also to loose issues, because this was an actual print periodical. These are four titles, I should say, of proceedings of the annual meeting of the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools and its various names. Basically, these titles have changed because that institution, that corporation, that body has changed name. And so in this case, we have several issues shelved together. They all have notes on them, the individual issues themselves, and each of these 4 titles also has a shelved as note in the catalog to direct people to this particular space on the shelf where they are shelved as Southern Association proceedings. Some titles are misshelved due to typography. In this case, how the title is presented on the cover of the magazine. In this case, Ziff Davis Smart Business is the example I want to show you. This was shelved as Smart Business, and you'd think, well, that makes sense. Smart Business is the largest almost the largest thing on the cover here. And the Ziff Davis is kind of small, it's at the top. But according to the catalog record, the 245 lists this title as Ziff Davis Smart Business. So this is another example of we left it where it was. We didn't change it or move it around or anything. I added a shelved as note to the catalog so that users can find this particular issue in the S's, not in the Z's. And we didn't add any labels to the issues, although I normally would have, because this title is scheduled to be discarded. So we just left them as they were. People can look it up in the catalog and find the cross-reference, but the issues themselves, we figured it was not worth it to relabel them. There were some titles that were just very unusual. An example of this, you can see here in this magazine holder, there's a single issue of Wild Bird. This is a birding magazine. This title wasn't listed in our in-house Microsoft Access serials database. We don't know where it came from or why it didn't have any accompanying issues. Maybe it was just something random, but in any case, this title was added to our discard list for Margot to pull, since we don't have any reason really to keep it. But it was a surprising and wonderful find all the same. And lastly, wonderful surprises. Sometimes wonderful things show up. In this case, for you serials catalogers out there, this is GBEA Journal. A single issue was found with GBEA Armchair Bulletin. The reason this is exciting is this is the first issue of this journal. And in serials cataloging, the description is ideally based on the first issue. Any description is based on the earliest issue that you have in hand. And there is a record in OCLC for this title, but it was based on a much later issue. So this will give us the ability to perhaps enhance that record a little bit. It was really cool to find it. This was the only issue there. There weren't any others, but it was the first issue, and that's all we need. So that was exciting. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Margot here for some lessons that we learned.
So what we would have done differently. First, once we realized that we were going to have to record all of those problems, we should have made a more formalized problem spreadsheet with more problems. And second, there was some occasional duplication of work because Miriam is amazing and works incredibly fast. And sometimes I would still be downstairs in the stacks working on it, and she'd already be fixing things, leading to some duplication. So what we decided after was let the other person know that you're done with your portion. Also, there is a lot of physical labor, and if you're short, then you might need and spend a lot of time going up and down on step stools. Do this in small doses. Back to Miriam for some tips and tricks.
Awesome. Thanks, Margot. So just some tips from the cataloging side of things if you're thinking about this kind of a project. Holding statements. What we did here, and of course, this is up to the individual library, we decided to construct our holding statements according to ANSI NISO C3971, as I mentioned earlier. We decided to use level 4 holdings for print and level 3 for microfilm. And in some cases, though, we did use level 4 holdings for microfilm if we had a single microfilm reel and we had more than one title on that reel. And sometimes if a title changes, like not at the beginning of a volume, but midway through, like the new title starts with volume 41, number 3, or something like that, we would want to note that on the label just so patrons know exactly that we have those issues up to the end or starting from the beginning, if you're talking about the succeeding title. Also, in terms of physical processing, work from the item itself. So in this case, pull the microfilm you need to relabel, you can also create the new labels at the shelf if your workspace is set up for that. Or what you can do what we did, which is take photographs at the shelf. I would go down with my cell phone, take a picture of the boxes or whatever I needed to work on, and then come back up to where my computer and my printer and everything were and do what I needed to do. But I at first started out with a sheet of paper with the holdings listed, a printout from our Access database. And that wasn't sufficient. I just found myself constantly going back down to check things. So photographs don't lie. Take the photograph, work from it, and you won't have to be going back and forth to the shelves. Also, use cardstock for the microform box labels. They're a little bit more durable. They're easier to insert. I used regular paper for a lot of these. If I had to do over again, I would use the cardstock, which is what a lot of our boxes had previously. And we had a lot of leftover cardstock in our technical services supply closet, and also from our GovDoc old card catalog that we had. So those are useful. If you're unable to print on the cardstock because they're really, those small pieces, if you have a typewriter, that's a really good thing. We used our typewriter for ours, and it was actually a better contrast than the printer oftentimes. And also, just another thing to keep in mind, I mentioned this previously when I was talking about Parents Magazine, just be careful with label clutter if you're dealing with several title changes in one microfilm box, especially if you have titles that change after just a few years. There's a lot that can fit into a microfilm box, and if a title's changing every few years, you could have several changes that you'd have to note, and then you're talking about smaller font, and it just gets a little strange. So be careful when dealing with that, and decide if it's really necessary to pursue that. Newspapers have special considerations. Newspapers are a little bit more involved even than just regular microfilm. Often this is because they have multiple levels of chronology and enumeration. A lot of times the enumeration can change frequently. The chronology can drop off or reappear again. And in this case, I would say just balance your desire for those detailed holdings, if that is your policy to have detailed holdings for newspapers, against other considerations, such as the likelihood of future weeding, the staff time that it requires. Oftentimes there are missing or illegible issues on microfilm reels for newspapers, especially if they're very, very old. We have this problem with a lot of our historical newspapers. Also, the microfilm itself can cause some issues. There's time spent scrolling through every single issue. Is that really something that you have the time to do? Do you have the equipment that you need? Are they in good working order? How many microfilm readers do you have? Also, patron needs come into play. We have 2 readers downstairs, but often when I was working on this project, I would go down thinking, okay, I've got a few hours, I'll do some newspaper holding checks. But a patron was using the machine. So of course, I knew I'd have to come back later. So that's something also to keep in mind. And I would suggest if you were going to start this kind of project and you're interested in doing the microfilm inventory as well, do it last when you've worked out all the issues in your process, and also when you have a lot of time that you can kind of go back and forth and maneuver. It can be very involved with the newspapers. Okay, I'm going to turn things back over to Margot for our final stats.
So after all of this, we found out of the 2,995 titles, we were unable to account for 6 of them. 12 additional titles were cataloged, and of course, we found one shelf that was about to collapse. So our next steps. First, we were going to find the titles that were supposed to be down there but are not, which we completed in April. And now we're going to begin the comparison of electronic journals and physical journals. This was originally to be completed in January 2024, but we started it in April and did almost 800 titles in 1 week. And you can see our next spreadsheet, which hopefully will be next year's GIGM presentation. Any questions?
I think we do have a question in chat, Miriam and Margot, about from Karen. What do you think about organizing by call number? Would that have helped minimize confusion from title changes by keeping everything together?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting question, Karen. I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, when I first came here 13 years ago, we had a local we used a local call number in the bib record, the 099, and we used ZP numbers. And I don't know where those got started. It might have been maybe a carryover from some previous local practice that we had here at the library. But we have always shelved our periodicals by title. Call number would be an interesting way to do it because, and this may have helped us with our project had we had our stuff organized by call number, because I know a lot of times if you have a serial that is shelved under a particular call number, any succeeding serials, unless they have a change of subject, also get that same call number. So that would have helped us as far as having a title and then all of its succeeding iterations. Those would have all been together, and they would have been together basically by policy rather than the way that we had it in our situation, which is sometimes it worked out that there were some succeeding titles, but we had to learn that every single time because there wasn't a standard. But that would have been a really nice thing about having the serials organized by call number, is that you would have had succeeding titles. Again, assuming that they keep the same subject content. shelved together. So that would be a really good reason to shelve by call number. The issue, though, the possible downside is that not all serial records have a call number in them. So that would be something that if a person were starting out building a collection, they'd want to be sure that they either had records that had the call number, or they would have to go in and just assign them manually. Any other questions? I see a question. During this process, did you have to update your holdings in OCLC? Yes, we did. A lot of times when we were going through, especially when we were dealing with titles that were shifting, and we found that there were actually more issues of the succeeding title that we didn't know we had, or more issues of the preceding title, or with the microfilm situation of the title sandwiched in between other titles. When we updated, my policy was, whenever I updated anything in the catalog in Alma, I would immediately go right into OCLC and update the local holding record at that same time, just so I didn't get behind or confused. Other folks may have another way of doing it. If you've got a setup where you have maybe a spreadsheet or something that you're keeping, that would work also. But I just did it all at one time, so I was sure. And then that also helps because you can copy then the 866 from Alma directly into the LHR summary field, which is really helpful. And we use coded fields in our local holding records, so there was a little bit of work with those, but we found that was the easiest way to do it. So we're going to have some serious OCLC stats come June because of this project. Any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but if anything comes up, or if you're still thinking about it, please feel free to email either myself or Margot. We'd be delighted to help you with any questions or answer any questions you might have. So we're here and available. And thank you all for attending and for listening.
Yep, this was great. Thank you all very much. Everybody take care.